Welcome back, psychologists, and welcome back to our next live stream. This is our July 17th live stream, and I'm excited to talk to you guys some about what's going on in our psychology class and what you can expect in the coming weeks, as well as jump in and answer some of your questions too. So, as always, I'm excited to have those questions you guys turn in to me, and then if you can think of anything else, feel free to drop into the chat and let me know what questions you guys have, or follow up with some follow-up questions later. I'm sure you know this already if you're watching this after the fact, but remember that if you can't tune in live, you can always catch it later. I make sure to save this stuff to YouTube so we can check in and see whenever it works out for you. If you're like at work or something, you probably shouldn't be watching this. So what I want to do is start off today by talking to you guys about a couple of changes that you'll notice in the class already, some of the stuff that's coming up in the next couple of weeks, and planning, I know it feels kind of crazy, for the end of the semester. And then we'll jump into the questions that you guys have. One of the things that you'll notice if you check on the class homepage now is that there are 2 new assignments, yay, for next week. One of them you knew was coming, and that's that second research and analyze assignment. If you don't remember from before, I've talked about it a few times now, but it felt like maybe now was not the time to do an assignment focused on breaking the rules and not doing what you're told. Now it's like I can be a cool kid with everybody else, sure. But really, right now, when it's a matter of public safety and we really need people to get with the program on things like social distancing and wearing masks and not going to the store when you don't absolutely have to, now's just maybe not a really great time for me to say, hey, don't go with the flow. So instead, what I've done is given you guys a second research and analyze assignment, what I'm calling doing well by doing good, little plan words that I'm particularly proud of. And this is focused entirely on leveraging social influence to get people to do something that we're going to be talking about a lot next week, which is to engage in prosocial or altruistic behavior. Prosocial behavior is behavior intended to help other people. So often we imagine that prosocial behavior is like helping a little old lady across the street or donating money, but it comes in tons of forms. Much like aggression, which we simply define as behavior intended to hurt others, prosocial behavior is like the opposite. It's kind of like anything you do that helps somebody else out, even if that helps you out, even if it means pretty much doing nothing. Sitting at home when you'd rather be out doing something else because you know that going out could help spread the pandemic, that's prosocial behavior. Wearing a mask, not to protect yourself, but to prevent the spread of a disease that you might be carrying asymptomatically, that's prosocial behavior. A lot of what we're asking people to do right now is that kind of prosocial stuff. When we move into the realm of altruism, this is kind of a philosophical difference. This is when you're doing something prosocial theoretically for selfless means. If you're somebody who engages in certain psychological states, I think it's psychological egoism. We imagine that everything is selfish. And that says that even if you wear that mask, right, it's a selfless thing you're doing and you hate doing it because you feel like you can't breathe, but you do get to feel really smug deep down inside and it makes you feel like a good person. It's a selfish thing, but it's still prosocial behavior. So what I'm asking you guys to do in the second research and analyze assignment is to leverage what you know about social pressures and about conformity, about compliance, and about obedience to get people to do the right thing. Rather than planning to resist social pressures, I want you to research, figure out what it is you can learn about getting people to do stuff, whether it's through persuasion, through your own actions, or through your use of power to try to make people do what they should do to act pro-socially during the COVID crisis. And then, of course, make use of your research to come up with a good plan and write up a good report for me on it. There are details in the research and analyze doing well by doing good assignment that you can find on the homepage. Super cool stuff. Second thing, I want to ask for your guys' help because you're the people that I want to talk to about this stuff. I've been talking with other faculty in the social sciences department about the fact that we don't really get to have a lot of conversations about the COVID stuff, as well as the fact that a lot of what we're seeing here, much like we've been talking about in this class, much of what we're seeing in terms of how people are responding is not only not surprising, it was all but inevitable, and about how it can be helpful to have these conversations in the context of social sciences research to better understand what's going on and why. It doesn't make the situation any better, but at least it makes it a little less surprising, a little more predictable, and hopefully a little less scary. So what we're hoping to do is have conversations between people like me and other social sciences instructors, including other psychology instructors, but also anthropologists, geographers, political scientists, historians, sociologists, about what this stuff means, this COVID stuff means in the context of their disciplines. It's a great opportunity to contribute to our knowledge about social sciences, to understand COVID a little bit better, but even to just gain an understanding of the difference between disciplines like sociology and psychology. It always hurts me inside a little bit when somebody says that they really enjoyed my sociology class, and it's like, it wasn't a sociology class, right? So my hope is that we can have these really cool conversations. But what I need to get from you guys, and there's a new participation assignment on the homepage now about this, is some idea of what it is you'd like to talk about. I'm asking for your contributions in terms of suggestions for themes that you'd like discussed in some of these conversations, as well as specific questions you'd like answered. Maybe you want to ask a geographer about the differences between how states in the southeast versus states in the northwest have responded to COVID, or why we saw such like an early crisis in places like Italy versus in the United States. Or maybe you'd like a cultural perspective, a sociological perspective, or an historical perspective on our response to COVID versus our response to the 1918 flu epidemic, right? Some cool stuff in there. So jump in there, give us an idea of the themes you want to talk about, as well as the questions you have, and we'll talk about some of this cool stuff with you guys. So it's an exciting, really cool college-wide project that I'm excited to be doing with you guys. So I think that hits like the majority of the stuff. I'm really excited at this point in the semester to be making this transition, talking about aggression and altruism in general. We'll talk about this in a little bit more depth with some of the questions you guys have been asking this week. But I really like it because it's another opportunity to take what it is we're talking about, something like aggression and badness, and turn it on its head. I'm also excited to have this kind of like two opposites in the space of 2 weeks and talk about how these opposites are maybe not all that opposite at all. Without further ado, I'm going to jump into some questions. We got some course-related questions, some material-related questions, and then some personal questions that I'm excited to answer too. I also have some recommendations coming up for you guys at the end. Our first couple of questions relate directly to the class information that we're talking about this week. The first one says, do you believe that aggression comes from nature or nurture? One of the things that's really tough is in working in a scientific discipline like psychology, I always have to be careful in terms of talking about what it is I believe, because one of the things I always want to work hard to do is to not hold on to ideas even when the evidence shows that they're wrong. So even though we might say like, well, what do I believe? I'll say, well, maybe this is what I think now, but when I see evidence, I'll change my mind. The nature and nurture debate is one of the oldest debates, not just in psychology, but in all of science and philosophy. And we have records going all the way back to ancient Greek philosophers that guys like Plato and Aristotle were arguing about this stuff. And the nature and nurture debate means generally, is something inherent or is it something that comes from our surroundings? And I would believe, rather I'd say we have lots of evidence that it's both nature and nurture that produces aggression and aggressive behavior. We tend to have evidence from genetic studies, for example, that there are genes that influence maybe not how aggressively people will act, but their threshold for things like frustration and irritation before they start expressing aggressive behavior. The presence of genes like the warrior gene, which is a silly name, shows that there are certain certain genes that people can inherit that make them more or less likely to respond to situations more or less stressfully. And if you get a certain combination of genes, you'll be like a pretty cool cat. And if you get another combination of genes, you're more of a hothead, right? But this stuff all exists on a spectrum, and we also know that there are huge environmental factors that come into play. I talk extensively in the videos this last week about the role of culture, for example, and about how, like, if you're raised in a culture like in North Central Florida, a culture of honor, you're much more likely to respond to perceived slights and insults in a really aggressive way than somebody from another part of the country or another country entirely. It doesn't mean that people from our area are more aggressive, just that certain things are more likely to produce that kind of aggression. We need to remember, too, that when we talk about kinds of aggression, that this really matters, because there are certain behaviors that you and I might not think of as aggression, but they are, that they're just a different kind, that like relational or indirect aggression is still aggressive behavior. We're still harming somebody. We're just not doing it like to their face. We're not hitting somebody, right, physically. Boom, 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 violence. One of the things that's really helpful is that we do know that the role of culture in society is really powerful. and that surrounding people with good influences and giving parents, for example, ideas of other ways to deal with bad behavior can end up removing violence from the equation. Again, aggression is not necessarily bad, but violence isn't something that we often use as a tool today in constructive ways. And one example is like corporal punishment. We now know that corporal or physical or violent punishment has a lot of negative outcomes. It doesn't tend to solve the behavioral problems, and it can produce problems in the future. Like kids are more likely to be domestic abusers, and they're more likely to commit violent crimes in the future. And one of the biggest things that we can do to help parents avoid corporal punishment is not to tell them that they're bad parents, because they're not. They're doing what they think is best, but to give them additional tools so that they have other opportunities to interact with their children and to move that behavior in a direction that they'd like. Another thing that we know is a really big role in the production of aggression is income inequality. Being poor sucks, and when you're poor, seeing people with lots of money around you makes it suck even worse, and that frustration and irritation can produce a lot of poor, I don't mean poor like money, I mean like the kind of behaviors we don't want, right? So, in the end, what we tend to see is that social programs that like give money to people, that make rent more affordable, that lower prices for utilities, that supplement income, that make education more viable, all that stuff tends to reduce violent crime rates in really big ways, a lot more than increasing police presence does, which can actually increase crime rates because it increases stress. So dealing with the kind of stress that can produce aggressive behavior leads us to our next question. What kind of techniques do you employ when you start getting aggressive to calm down? Fidget spinner, counting to 10. Well, you guys know, like, I'm a super cool cat, so like, I'm all about, like, vaping and fidget spinners and stuff like that. Like, if I want to feel good, I just dab like a cool person, right? But for real, like, one of the biggest things we know that can help you deal with stress in constructive ways is to find constructive ways to deal with that aggression. One of the biggest things you can do is to make use of social support networks that you already have. I know I was talking to somebody just recently about that phrase, like, well, I can't complain or you can't complain. It's like, you sure as hell can complain, and that's okay. If you've got somebody who's positive and supportive that you can talk to, just getting that out there is really helpful. But also making use of things like mindful meditation can be really helpful. It helps you deal with emotions in constructive ways. And if you find that this behavior is getting in the way of your ability to operate on a regular basis, engaging with a therapist or a counselor can be really helpful. Behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapies in particular are really helpful. There are other things that can be helpful, like not using stimulants. So if you make use of even just coffee, right? Or if you use the hard stuff like cocaine or Mountain Dew Code Red, like that stuff's not good for you. It tends to raise that anxiety and that activation threshold, and you're more likely to act aggressively when you're under the influence of stimulants like that. Also, if you're going through withdrawal from a stimulant, like you haven't had your coffee in the morning or you really need that drink in the evening, you're more likely to act aggressively. So taking those like kinds of constructive steps that feel like common sense, they really do tend to work. I've got a few more personal questions here. Do you prefer teaching classes online or in person? Which way do you think is more effective? This is a really tricky question. I talked during our last live stream about the fact that I tend to like teaching in person, but that's just because I have more experience there. I'm getting more competent, and as a result, I enjoy it more. But it tends to get tricky because we tend to see that in-person classes have much higher success rates with students. But it's really hard to tease that out. Is it because in-person learning is better than online learning? Or is it because that's just what we're used to? Or is it because we haven't hit on the tools that are good for online learning? I think right now it's almost a moot point, given that what we're seeing is that there's a big trade-off. That in the fall, in-person learning might be really like good for learning stuff, but you're risking the lives of the people in those classrooms and everyone they interact with. As we say, like, is it really worth it then to say, we'll have in-person classes to have marginally better learning, or maybe we just need to all get better at learning online, teachers and students alike. So I think, I know it's a cop-out, but I'd say, like, it doesn't really matter. I'm teaching online in the fall, and I'm going to do the best job I can. Our next question, what chapter are you most excited for in the next couple of weeks? I think probably the chapter I'm most excited about is the cooperation and competition chapter. That, along with our stuff on aggression and altruism and threatened sense of self and in-groups and out-groups, like all of this stuff together is the core of what I like to think about when I engage in my like trashy reality TV watching. It's a lot of really interesting stuff. And figuring out the situations that will lead people to act aggressively or altruistically, they're the same situational elements that are likely to make us cooperate with others or try to screw somebody else out of something so that we can get it. It all meshes together really nicely, and I like it. Our next question, what's your favorite module from this course and why? Have we already learned the material or is it in the upcoming modules? I have a really hard time picking this stuff because it all comes together really well. I think in the early modules, my favorite stuff is on cognitive biases, especially the ones about ourselves and about how we really don't see ourselves the way that we are. I really love the module focused on social influence, the nearly invisible ways in which we influence each other, and that learning that demanding something of someone is probably the least effective way to get it from them. Like, these are things that really open my eyes in a big way. But I think probably, maybe the most important chapter in this whole class is the one on stereotyping and its consequences, because there are so many elements of our society today, and I mean the BLM movement emerged directly out of this. So many elements of our society today that deal with people in groups, and certain people in certain groups get more, and certain people in other groups get less. But we know that it's bad to be like, racist and sexist and ageist, so we deny these things. And this chapter really is all about how, and the module is really all about how that stuff is still present, and I like to look at these things and see that in fact they're present and what it is we can do to fix them. So that's something I'm excited to talk with you guys about in the future. I've got some other personal questions here, moving away from the class, coming up in our next group. If you hadn't pursued a career in psychology, where do you think you'd be today? Making a hell of a lot more money, I think. Knowing now what I wish I'd known when I was making a career decision, I was encouraged to follow my dreams, which is awesome, but psychology is not a very high earning dream. And I really wish I'd understood what kinds of jobs are available, what kind of money those jobs make, and what the day-to-day experience is like. I think there are a lot of us who know somebody who works in a job and we want to be like them, or we saw somebody on the TV and we wanted to be like them. I was convinced I wanted to be Steve Irwin until I was 17 years old, because it just he was a cool guy and I wanted to be like him. But I didn't have any real understanding of what that job would be like or what it took to get there. I lucked into the job that I'm in now. I kicked around for a long time, not really knowing what I wanted to do, much less what I would do. And I really think if I'd had the opportunity to work with somebody in an area before deciding to go there, I would have gone a different direction. I love psychology, but it would be really cool to connect it with something like architecture or engineering or grassroots organizing. There's a lot of really cool stuff that we could do with this stuff, and there are just a lot of opportunities that could have been cool to take. Our next question, how is Grady doing with the COVID lockdown? Can he tell things are different? I think he's really excited that we're home as much as we are, but I think something he's really frustrated about is that we don't get to go and do cool stuff. I think the combination right now of the COVID lockdown and the horrible, horrible weather means that we don't really get to do a whole heck of a lot. I think we've even stopped going on walks and stuff, and with the number of cases that we've got, going to the pool is out. So it's kind of like we've got a little portable swimming pool in the back. We got a sprinkler, and that's our outside fun time. He's kind of a wild kid who loves to go and do stuff. So convincing him that we've got to stay inside is not super easy, but we know it's worth it. And, even if we're not at risk, we want to make sure that we're not spreading stuff for other people. Our next follow-up question, what's your favorite podcast to listen to? I have a number of podcasts that I love. If you like psychology and social psychology in particular, I really can't recommend, well, I guess I make you guys listen to a number of these. Cautionary Tales is one of my favorites, absolute favorites. I listening to Tim Harford, I just love his voice. But another one that's really great is 99% Invisible, all about the nearly invisible elements that influence us in our built environment. So it's really about the connection between things like psychology and architecture and history. And when I say environment, I mean the buildings and spaces we're in. It's a really, really awesome podcast. And the guy who hosts it, Roman Mars, beautiful voice. Apart from that, there's a whole collection of podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff produced by the McElroy family. My Brother and Me is a really fun podcast. They say it's an advice show, but it's really a comedy show, and it's gotten me through some really, really tough stuff. I got into Dungeons and Dragons thanks to their D&D podcast called The Adventure Zone. start at the very beginning. It's really fantastic. But there are also really cool other podcasts, like a medical history one called Sawbones, Schmanners, all about manners and etiquette, and Wonderful, all about some really cool stuff. Keep me in line with like some of my favorite stuff. What's your favorite Zelda game? I love that this drills down into a very specific area of enthusiast culture. If you judge just by the hours, Breath of the Wild, I think is a really incredible game, and I've sunk hundreds of hours into it. Just being able to explore makes it beautiful, and playing it on master mode, which is really hard, I love, because I don't know, I'm a masochist who loves to lose at video games. I just get to embrace it. But apart from that, I really enjoy Ocarina of Time. I grew up with. And if you're looking for something a little bit different in indie on the Switch, there's a Cadence of Hyrule, Crypt of the Necrodancer / Legend of Zelda. It's a rhythm roguelike with awesome remixes of Zelda music. It's one of my favorite games because I just have no idea how it even happened in the first place. It's really good. A question about quarantine stuff, right? What are your approaches to coping with the ongoing quarantine? It's really tough, and I can't say that I'm doing great with it. One of the mistakes I know that we make is to check the news way more often than we should, looking at the number of cases and worrying about what the fall is going to be like. I think finding ways to entertain ourselves while not out in public is a really big one. I know it's really easy because of the legitimate power that public figures hold, encouraging us to be out in public, because the power of normative conformity and seeing a lot of people out in the open, it just feels like stuff is safe. But we got to remember that every single day we've got 3 times as many cases as we had in March, and even if it feels like it's not a big deal here in Gainesville, we're still not doing any better in Gainesville than we were doing earlier. Especially as we get into the fall, we got to remember all those folks from South Florida are coming back up to Gainesville, right? And that it's not going to be a great time to be out there in the open. So finding things that you can enjoy doing at home. There's a reason everybody talks about getting into woodworking or knitting or video games or binge watching stuff, and finding other ways to connect with the people you normally meet with in person, whether that's like making use of Netflix's, like, what's the group watch feature that you can do where you can like watch stuff with other people, right? Or doing a Zoom call with your mom. All that stuff, is a good way to stay connected with people. Also, don't hoard toilet paper, but make sure you got toilet paper, right? Speaking of that, got a question. Favorite documentary to watch that explores different aspects and themes of psychology? I think, my favorite ones are the historical documentaries that come directly from sources like Solomon Asch and Philip Zimbardo and Stanley Milgram. Obedience, the Stanford Prison Experiment, and Asch's stuff on conformity are some of my favorite psychology documentaries because they come from this time where psychology was really growing fast, and you can tell that these researchers are full of they're egotistical and really full of themselves. And the result is, these studies that they believe are these really huge things, and they're really interesting to watch. But if you embrace them, not as like psychological findings, but instead as their own self-contained stories, right? They can be really interesting stuff. I mean, we now know like Stanley Milgram didn't debrief all of his subjects, and there were people who went 3 years thinking they'd killed a person. Philip Zimbardo's study where like the guards abused the prisoners, it turns out some of those guards had like been through studies before. They knew what was going on, and they'd planned ahead of time that they wanted to be sadistic, right? It's like these things are hot messes, and it's cool to watch them unfold like in a documentary setting. Also, any book recommendations that explore psychological studies or topics of psychology as a whole? I really like, I know it's not psychology specifically, but I recommended Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. I'm also a really huge fan of Malcolm Gladwell's work. So Outliers, Tipping Point, those are really good things. Anything like that really engages with psychology in an accessible way. I thought I had it here with me, but I guess I don't. Sensory Exotica is one that I really like because maybe it's not really psychology, but it's about how other animals perceive the world, which is really cool. Do you believe that showing up and doing your best, even if it doesn't work, is a key to success? Showing up, you miss 100% of the opportunities you don't take advantage of, right? To paraphrase, or to extra long phrase, right? You got to show up and you got to work in order to do well. But really being successful doesn't necessarily mean committing to doing your best every single time, because that's kind of unreasonable. Sometimes you're tired or you're hungry or you didn't sleep well, and it'll be hard to do your best. So really focusing on showing up and working a little bit every single day and pushing your limits just a little bit, operating within oh geez, I'm just losing this here. But operating at the frontiers of your ability, being willing to embrace being a little bit uncomfortable, that's how we get better and be successful. One of the really big things that a lot of people our inspirational thinkers don't like to say is that we need to set reasonable goals. We have to remember that when we look at, success advice from people like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, that what we're seeing here is a survivor bias, that we're not just seeing, advice from every business person who tried to be successful. We're seeing it only from these people. And we often make use of dispositional attributions thinking, well, that's who I want to think of because they are the successful people, because they're the ones who will be able to tell me because they made it. But we forget that it's not really them that made them successful. Situationally, it was the settings that they found themselves in, that they were lucky enough to encounter people to mentor them in just the right way. They were lucky enough to be able to get the money that they needed or to have the right idea in the right place at the right time. Of course, because of how we think of ourselves, they don't attribute their success to their lucky surroundings. They tend to attribute their success to their individual abilities. And they say, well, you should do what I did, which was, everybody needs to go on a retreat to the Himalayas in order to be successful, which is nonsense, right? So what can be really helpful is to set reasonable goals and work toward achieving those goals and constantly setting higher and higher and higher goals, and what that means is that not only are you going to achieve more realistically, but you're going to build up a backlog of success so that you're more resilient. And when you do have a hard time, you can look back on, situations in which you've struggled before and say, you know what, I struggled and it took hard work, but in the end I was successful. Because even though it can feel really great to hit that, half court shot that is a moonshot, that can feel really good, but you're going to miss it 99 times out of 100. And in the end, you'll look back on your attempts and say well, I just can't be successful. I work hard and it never pays off, right? So, setting yourself up for success is really cool too. Speaking of setting yourself up for success, don't forget to look online for information on that research and analyze assignment, as well as the new participation assignment. If you have future questions for me, remember you can email me, send a Canvas message, you can call or text, you can stop in during office hours, or submit questions to our live stream like this one. I'll look forward to talking to you guys during the next live stream, as well as my intro video for next week. Don't lose faith in humanity just yet, because next week's all about how we're all secretly good people, even those of us who may act like we're real garbage people. Everybody deep down inside has a little bit of that good stuff to it. So looking forward to that stuff. Until then, let me know if you have questions. I'm your Professor Ryan Keith, and this is Social Psychology. Thank you for joining me for the July 17th live stream. Have a great week.